Okay, so I'll go ahead and briefly start as more folks start to come in. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Camila Fernandez, and I am a senior program associate with Enterprise, and I work with our program team out of our New York market office. And today I am joined by Dave McCary, who works with our IT software engineering department out of our Columbia headquarters. And Dave will be facilitating today's discussion, which is really focused on how to implement a digital strategy to help you advance the mission or the goals of your organization. We'll also touch on cybersecurity, data privacy, and some tips for working remotely. Before we start, I do want to mention some brief things, and that is that we will be reserving some time at the end for a brief Q&A session, but we do encourage folks that as the presentation is ongoing, that you insert any questions you might have in the chat box, and depending on the time and the length of the questions, we will address them as they come, but if not, we'll put a pin on them and we'll address them during the Q&A session at the end. So before we get into the presentation, I just want to note this presentation is being recorded. So we will be following up with like the PowerPoint as well as the webinar recordings. So with that, I'll pass it on to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully we can have a very good discussion today. So I do plan to stop after each section to ask for questions at that point, just so you could try to get some questions in as we're going. But I do want to keep the presentation on track, so I may push us along and save the questions for the end if we run out of time for each section. But I do want to try to keep it open to have discussions as much as possible. So with that, let me go ahead and jump in. So Kamala already talked about the basic topics we want to go into. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Dave McCary. I've been working in IT for about 25 years now, and I've worked across a variety of industries, including biotech, financial services, manufacturing, high tech. So I have a pretty broad perspective. I started at Enterprise. Today is actually my 1-year anniversary. I started on March 17th of 2020. Which was an interesting time to start a new job, considering that's exactly when things started to be shut down for COVID. So it's been interesting to kind of get up to speed at a new place in that situation. But overall, I think we're moving through it, and hopefully we can continue to do that, and everyone stays safe. So let me go ahead and jump in. So the first thing is digital strategy. So why should we care about technology and digital technologies? Obviously, all of you have signed up for this session, so you obviously have some interest in it. But to put it all on the line, ever since the iPhone came out in 2007, people more and more expect digital experiences in how they work and how they operate. Everybody's using their phone to manage their what they have to buy at the grocery store or different things they have to do. Employees, partners, customers, they're all expecting those similar sort of interactions in how they work with their businesses and how they do their job. So no matter how you slice it, technology is going to be part of what you do. And you can either manage it or you can let people decide on their own what technologies they're going to use, which can be a problem. And obviously you want to keep track of what technologies are being used. I make sure that things like data privacy are being taken into account. So as I was just saying, talking about, COVID did happen, and it began to accelerate people moving to digital interactions and how they do their day-to-day jobs. It didn't create the situation. That trend was already started. It only accelerated it. So we have to fully expect it will continue well after COVID is over. People are going to expect to operate using technologies and interact in digital ways. So given technology is going to be part of our jobs, across all industries, all jobs. People are going to be touched by it. Considering that's going to happen, we don't necessarily want people deciding on their own what technologies they should use or how they should share files with partners or people they're working with day to day. You want to make sure you keep track of what technologies are being used for these purposes. Laws and regulations are changing quickly, and you need to keep tabs on them and be sure you track what's going on. So where do we go from here? Let me first off start by talking about IT strategies. So historically, projects would be started at companies where you'd have a consulting firm come in and they would potentially spend months, if not years, fully evaluating all aspects of your business, what technologies are in place, what technologies should be in place, what technologies should you use, and they'll set budgets and roadmaps that might last for years. So overall, this approach does have some advantages, but there's some reasons why we need to move to a new digital strategy type of approach. A big problem with the IT strategy is that one, it could be months before anybody sees any improvements. All you get at the end of that first project is a plan for what to do in the future. Nothing starts happening. People don't have new tools in hand. Their jobs don't get easier yet. Obviously, we want to start pushing out changes much more quickly. Second, technology is changing extremely fast. So what may be a good idea today may be obsolete in 6 months or a year. So you can't be necessarily setting a plan for what technology you may be using a year from now because things are going to change. So when I talk about digital strategy, really the basic crux of that is get to the point where you're implementing changes based on short-term goals. Figure out what are your highest impact priority areas that you should be working on. What are the main business problems you should be thinking about? Begin to implement changes on short timelines to get in there. And then after you release it, continue to iterate on it. What's working, what's not working, continuously adjust, reprioritize. A disadvantage of this approach is obviously you're learning as you go, and you potentially there is potentially some rework that you might have to do because you didn't necessarily figure out everything all down to all parts of the technology from the beginning. That is going to happen, but the best part is that you can adjust very quickly. If something's not working, just change to something else and move on. Don't let it linger. So fail fast and adjust. Reprioritize. Continuously push changes out to users, see how it's working, and then improve it and enhance it as you go. So the whole concept of what I'm talking about there, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about how most software development is moving to an agile type of approach. That's the basic idea behind agile. So some best practices when implementing a digital strategy. First, this is not necessarily specific to digital strategies, but something to keep in mind. I have often seen people always start with a technology and think about, well, how can I start using this? Things like Bitcoin come out, and everyone starts talking about well, how can I start using blockchain for my business? Always start with the business problem. Don't think about the technology only after you say, okay, here's a business problem, and I think this technology might help us with this problem. Don't start with the technology and then try to find a business problem to solve with that technology. Very important for digital strategies are strong governance structures. If you're going to be reprioritizing work on a continuous basis, you need to make sure the right people are at the table to set those priorities, to think about what are the risks that should be mitigated when you're implementing these technologies. You need that committee in place. I'll talk a little bit more about that committee later on, but that's a very important part of a digital strategy is having the right people setting the priorities and constantly reprioritizing. Adapt to change. As I was just saying, change is going to happen. Your business is going to change. Technologies are going to change. Something that might be a great idea today is obsolete tomorrow. Expect that change and then just adapt and reprioritize based on those changes as they occur. Don't get bogged down in them. Don't if you need to make a change, don't fear making that change. Go ahead and do it. Next, so I talked about you want to focus on maybe 1, 2, or 3 specific business priorities you need to get after. So when I say that, that doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, well, data privacy isn't or security isn't my top priority right now. That doesn't mean you push that to the back burner. When you're implementing changes for a particular priority, you have to think about all risks that might go along with that priority. to implement the technology. Data privacy and security probably has to be in the discussion of everything you implement. A lot of you mentioned in the registrations for this session about people having access to the network. I was when people working at home, maybe their home internet connection isn't good or is not stable. You do have to be thinking about those other types of problems while you're implementing your priority changes. So I'm not saying that you forget about those things just because you prioritize something else. You have to consider what's involved in implementing that one particular priority. Next, set standards for the technologies you will use. A big advantage of the old way of IT strategies is that you would go in and figure out, here's all the technologies we'll use, here's the full gamut of technologies and platforms that'll be involved, and set those standards through a lot of due diligence up front. So just because we're moving to short-term goals doesn't mean we forget about thinking about the platforms and standard technologies you need to set. You should be thinking about those as you go, and as much as possible, set some of them up front so that you have those things in place. If you don't, keeping the what I'll call keeping the lights on and keeping the engine running after you release these technologies will get very expensive if everything's implemented with a different technology, with different ways of doing it, with different designs. You definitely have to keep those things in mind. I am a strong advocate for cloud technologies, especially for small firms that don't necessarily have large budgets to deal with a lot of the challenges of implementing technology. As much as possible, try to outsource some of those things to third parties. Let them deal with some of the challenges that you don't want to deal with. For example, having to rack servers and making sure that the servers are kept in a cool place so they don't overheat. Let somebody else worry about that, especially as a small firm. Keep your attention focused on your particular business problems. Cloud technologies help with that a lot. I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide, but of what the different initials that I have here of IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. I'll talk about what those are in a minute, but it gets to the point of what I was just getting after. Next, also historically, what was done with IT projects is you would set a budget based on a particular scope of work you want done by a particular date. So you'll say, okay, I want a new CRM system that's implemented by September of this year. Of course, in old world that might work, but in new, if you're going to be reprioritizing work on a monthly or weekly basis, you can't necessarily have these defined mandates in place from the start where you have a budget that's has to have complete functionality by a certain time. Because if you reprioritize, you won't finish on time on budget. So you really have to be thinking about capacity of being able to push changes and realize that the scope of what they're working on may change after the budget is already set. Last, identify key performance indicators and continuously monitor them so you understand, are you successful? Is it working? If it's not working, adjust and adapt to it. But it's important to be able to measure, are you achieving success? So going back to the point I was just talking about the different, so moving to cloud services, there's the concept of infrastructure as a service, which is IaaS, platform as a service, and software as a service. And ultimately, the difference between these items is how much do you maintain control of versus how much do you outsource to the third party. The more you move to the right, the more you outsource to the third party. So I would think, especially for small firms, very much you want to consider software as a service because you push more of that responsibility out the door and not have to worry about it yourself. Of course, the more you go to the right, the less flexibility you have. So obviously, if you're only using a third party to manage your servers or your virtual servers, but you have to control everything else above that, it gives you a lot more flexibility, but it also requires more money often, more employees with more diverse skill sets, which are not necessarily easy to come by. So obviously it'll be up to each firm to decide which layer of this they want to go to, but I would strongly encourage people moving to more and more to the software as a service. To give an example, so I actually have a lot of experience with Salesforce. I'm not necessarily advocating that you should also use Salesforce, but I very much appreciate what they did for situations that I worked in. Back in 2009, Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of Salesforce, actually came to the firm I worked at to convince us to use Salesforce as a platform. And he said something that's really stuck with me and I believe very much is true. And Salesforce is a software as a service platform. He said, we're not just implementing our software will not necessarily solve all your problems, but what it will do is focus the attention of your resources much more on the business problems that you need to solve. You're not worrying about things such as, are your servers overheating and stop working? You're not worrying about things such as disaster recovery and backups and system redundancies. Let them worry about that problem. Let you focus on what your core business problems are. I believe very much that software as a service helps with that type of thing. So where do you go from here? Where do you start? Start with the governance. Get the right people, figure out who should be part of the committee that chairs this work and talks about setting what priorities should be set. Make sure you get stakeholders from all parts of the business, that the right decisions are being made for the business as a whole for what technology work should be done. Also be sure to set escalation paths. If the committee cannot agree on what the priorities are, who makes the decision? Who does it escalate to? How does that work? And this committee, I would expect, it's going to be up to each firm to decide how often this committee meets, but they're going to have to meet often enough that they can set the priorities of what work is being done. That might be monthly, it might be quarterly. It really is going to be up to each firm to kind of decide what those are. Once you have the governing committee, next, okay, what are your priorities? What are the top things that you should be working on from a technology standpoint? Uh, what are the risks that you should be thinking about when you're implementing those technologies? Figure those things out. And for each priority you identify where you begin to implement technology, identify one person on that committee who's the sponsor for that particular effort. This should be somebody who's in the business that directly will benefit from a change being made. They shouldn't be the technical person or the IT person, so to speak. They should be somebody in the business that has a lot to gain by this technology being implemented well and this business problem being solved. So next, after you have your priorities, then begin to figure out what's your team. Spend some due diligence to figure out what platforms should you use. Should you use a Salesforce? Should you use Amazon Web Services? Should you use Google Cloud? Figure out what your platform should be that you're going to be using. That'll help you figure out what skill sets you'll need and what team you'll need to be able to implement these things. But realize, don't get stuck in the old world where you spend months or years in some cases figuring these things out. Put some due diligence into it, get the basic idea, but realize that you're going to be learning as you go. You're going to be setting new standards as you go. So you're probably going to need a subcommittee that thinks through those questions. And if there's a new issue that comes up that does not have a standard defined yet, define it at that point. And then after that, you're ready to go and start implementing changes. Again, set short-term goals. Maybe every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, you want to be releasing changes out to users. Do what I would call a minimal viable product. So when you release a change out to users, it doesn't necessarily have to solve all of their problems. Just get out the absolute essential things. They start using it. Then you learn based on what's working and continuously enhance it and improve it over time. And reprioritize often. So with that, let me actually open it up to some questions. I know I went through a lot of topics there, but sorry, I was not following the chat. So I see there's been some things that.
Yeah, people were introducing themselves, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to add them to the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourselves.
Yeah, you can go ahead and we can spend a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, talking through any questions anyone has. Has anyone already tried these types of things or familiar with what I'm talking about? Have you thought about doing them? Because I'll be honest, I mean, implementing some of these things are not easy, especially some of the cultural shifts of changing how you think about technology and doing what what I'm calling a digital strategy. I've worked at a few places that have tried to implement these things and do struggle to do it. It does take time, but I believe can pay off big if you can start doing work under this model. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump to the next topic. If any questions do come up, again, I'll stop after each section so we can go through them. So cybersecurity and data privacy. So almost all of you raised an issue that you're dealing with currently is this exact problem. Um, uh, a core point of this is no matter what organization you are being attacked from cyber criminals. It is happening. You can't think, oh, I'm a small firm. People are probably not interested in going after us. Believe me, they are. I mean, as is said in the quote, there are two types of firms. There's either those that have been breached and don't know it, or those that have been breached and do know it. That's everybody is being looked at and being attacked. So don't think that you're not being. Uh, Let me tell you a story of a perfect example. Often cyber criminals will go after the easiest target to get information, and people will often know that small firms do not necessarily have the sophistication around some of the data security areas. So if I'm knowing that information, I could potentially break into a small firm. If I were to just be able to get a list of passwords and email addresses, and I know that most people in the world use the same password for pretty much all their accounts. You know, they'll have all their bank accounts, all their work accounts will have the same password. So if I can get a list of maybe your customers, 200, 300 people, their password and email address, I can then start going to Bank of America website or other bank account websites and just start trying them and see which one logs in. Of course, if I get access to somebody's bank account, there's a lot of things I can do. So that would be something that will be more of an impact to your employees, your customers, and whoever else you might have their data. But I mean, very important for security is you not only have to protect yourself, but you have to make sure you're protecting the people that you work with. Uh, all these things can cause loss of reputation, which can be very difficult to recover. You can have legal challenges, you can have financial loss. Another thing to keep in mind is that privacy laws are changing very quickly. So California, I think, is the most comprehensive data privacy laws in the United States now. And to give you an example of the types of things that come with this law, first, it applies to residents of California. So your business may or may not have a presence in California. You may not often even do business in California. But if anybody who physically lives in California comes to your site, provides their personal data, that these rights apply to them, and they can potentially come after you if you don't satisfy these rights. So to give an example of it, some of them are things such as every person has the right to know what information you may have about them. So they could send you an email and say, can you tell me all the data you have about me? You know, do you have my social security number? Do you have my name? Do you have my phone number? And you're required to tell them what information you have. They also have the ability to request that you delete all of their information from all of your systems. And they have this legal right. So if you don't, they could come after you. So just to give an idea of some of the things that are required by law, California is the most comprehensive, but I think it's only a matter of time before all states catch up to it. And also the European Union is already, with GDPR, is already even more ahead of California. So it's coming across the board, probably if you like it or not. So some things to do in the short term to help with security. First, it is everybody's responsibility. Don't think that, well, there's somebody who owns data privacy who works in IT. They're responsible for making sure that things are kept safe. Yes, they do have a lot of responsibility, but ultimately it's everybody's responsibility to keep information safe. If, for example, a person were to export a list of all your customers with all their personal data to an Excel file and then send it over email to somebody outside of your firm, all that data is potentially at risk. And you have to make sure you don't do things like that. So to help with that problem, it's very important to have somebody very senior in your firm communicate to everybody in your firm how important security is and how everybody has to actively be involved in it and keeping data safe. Next, obviously, I mean, a lot of people brought up in the registrations for this session about, well, there's some people are very tech savvy and there's others that are not. Some people may not even understand what is cybersecurity, like what does that even mean? Why can't I send an Excel file with all of our customers' email addresses in it? Make sure that you implement a training program so people can understand these things. One thing that I've seen that works very well is like if you do hour or 2 hour long training sessions, people are not going to pick up much. I've seen a lot of third-party programs where they do things such as have 3 to 5 minute videos on a very specific topic, such as phishing or how to keep, don't use email for sensitive data, other types of topics. And what I've seen works very well is have a program where maybe every quarter you require, or every year, you require every employee to complete a certain number of these courses. They're short, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, but often they're short. They will often have a quiz at the end just to be sure people are paying attention to it and can kind of prove that they took the course. But I think those work very well. Often, many of these firms that provide this type of service with these short training courses, they will also do kind of simulated attacks to help prove, are people learning this topic or not? A perfect example is like under the last 2 firms I've worked, they've done simulated phishing attacks where emails are just randomly sent to people in the organization and it's just determined, did somebody click on a link? How many people clicked on a link? Was it 80% of your firm or was it 1%? To understand, how big the problem is. It also helps people recognize, like if they click on a link when they shouldn't have, it immediately gives them a warning, say, hey, you shouldn't have done this. This was a phishing attack. Um, and obviously, the more you can train people through simulated as opposed to it being real, the better. Of course, phishing is just one example. There's other types of simulations that can be done to test out for these sort of things. But that's going to be really important to really get everybody knowledgeable of what's going on. Another one, especially in the COVID world, is I was just talking a lot about sharing files through email. Again, provide a way for people to share files and share information not using email. At Enterprise, we use Microsoft Teams, which is just a great way to upload documents, and then others can download documents from their home or other places. There are a lot of other tools out there that can be used for that purpose, but make sure you're not sending sensitive data through email because it's not necessarily secure. Begin to define policies and practices. What should your policies be around cybersecurity? Maybe a big challenge that people brought up is like, well, people are using their own personal devices on our network. You probably won't be able to set a policy that says you can't use personal devices. Most of you are probably already in that game and have to support it, but maybe there's policies you set, well, if you do use a personal device, we need to be able to install tools that monitor, make sure that the latest patches are applied to your device or other controls are being put in place. The similar sort of controls that might be put on company issued devices. Define an action plan. What if an incident occurs? What if it's discovered that somebody's email account was breached and somebody got access to all the information in there? Begin to determine what actions would be taken to address that situation. That situation might come up. You don't want to have to figure it out after an incident already occurred and you're already trying to comply with laws of how quickly do I need to notify the user that their information was breached or something to that effect. One resource, this is not necessarily an action item, but a resource that I've found to be very useful is OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project. They provide a lot of information about best practices on how should, a perfect example in the cheat sheets that I have listed here, and this presentation includes the links, so you'll be able to get to these locations. But they'll do things such as, well, if you set up on your website the ability for people to reset their password, what are some best practices for how to do that to keep their information secure? I know we've all seen different ways that this is done. You get an email sent to your account, you answer various security questions such as what's your mother's maiden name or something like that. But OWASP gives cheat sheets on what they would say are good practices for that type of thing, and they have a lot of cheat sheets out there. I've personally found these to be very useful. So some mid to longer term actions to take related to data security. Again, this was a problem that a lot of people brought up is how do you deal with personal devices? This is going to have to be based on policies you set for your whole firm. And I know these won't necessarily be easy to set, but one thing I saw at the last location I worked is if you wanted a personal device on the network, you actually had to enable the admin from the company to wipe your device completely if it's lost. So for example, I lose my device, they would then be able to clear all the information off it. That would include my personal information, that would include the work information, that's everything. But policies like that might be worth considering. Again, that's not necessarily an easy one. Maybe you don't go to that level of extreme and do other types of things, but those types of things should be considered. And remember that security is probably going to be more important in a lot of cases. Another one is be sure that any infrastructure or applications you have are patched every 30 days. A very common way that data is breached is every month new security flaws are found in things like Microsoft Windows or other tools that are commonly used. And patches are sent out by the software companies to fix those vulnerabilities as they're found. Of course, if you don't apply the fixes to those vulnerabilities, then you're still at risk of them being breached by somebody. And the easiest thing to breach are known issues that have been communicated out to a wide group of people. A lot of people are going to know about what things have been fixed in these patches. They're going to be the easier targets to go after. So be sure that you're patching your software as quickly as possible. I would say 30 days at a minimum is how often things should be done. And also when it comes to a lot of you, I'm sure, are thinking, well, we don't have the resources or time to do that sort of thing. That's where cloud technologies can really come in. Things like SaaS providers or software as a service, let them deal with that problem. They do that already. Don't worry about that. Let them deal with having to patch the software every 30 days or whenever new critical security flaws are found and need to be patched. Another thing that's important is be sure that all information either at rest or in transit is encrypted, especially for any information in transit. So like if you have a web page where people are accessing sensitive information, be sure that that data is encrypted. So often you'll hear about SSL or TLS. Those are basically the technologies behind that encrypt information that's sent over the internet. Be sure that that's being used everywhere where data is being transferred between people. This might also be between integration points. So it's not only between people and systems, but it's also between system and systems. I think a good practice to follow is, especially for admin type roles that have privileged access, use two-factor authentication. For example, I personally, all of my bank accounts, I set up two-factor, which means I not only have to give my username and password to log in, but I'll then get a code that's sent to my phone that I have to enter to be able to log in. Um, Always have that as much as possible, because in the greater scheme of things, passwords are much more easy to breach. Two-factor gets a little bit harder. Of course, it's not perfect, but it does a lot to help. Another thing to consider is a centralized authentication tool or single sign-on. Why this is important, a very common issue that occurs is people will leave a company, uh, but their access is not fully removed once they leave. And this could be a problem. And of course, if you have 10 applications out there and their username and password and access to log in is set up in 10 different places, that means when they leave, are you getting after all 10 of those locations, or can you just turn it off in one central place and they're immediately removed from all of them? That's what I'm talking about there is set up some kind of centralized authentication. There's a lot of tools out there that deal with this problem, and a lot of things to consider. I talked about the governing body for digital strategy, but also probably important to have is a governing body for data privacy and security. Laws are changing constantly. This most likely is going to be led by your legal department, but not always. I mean, it's going to be up to each individual firm to decide how to do this. But you probably will need a governing body that's keeping track of what laws are changing and being sure that, working with people in the technology space to be sure that we're implementing ways to deal with these laws and comply with these laws. And as I was just talking about, as much as possible, try to outsource, do software as a service, let others worry about some of those problems, such as patching applications. So any questions about security? I've gone through a lot of things, so please feel free to jump in. Even if you give an experience, like something that worked for you, something that didn't work for you, something that might be of interest to others on the phone. I'm more than open. Sorry, I'm just looking through a couple questions here. I cannot speak for everyone, but where I would have an IT department. Yeah, I mean, I guess ultimately about kind of having a consulting firm that's really takes over your IT functionality or functions and helping to prioritize when you just don't have the people involved. And that is definitely a challenge. I mean, all I can really say is ultimately, you know, maybe do an RFP and search for other vendors that might be able to help with that sort of problem to get out of the reactive mode and move more to a proactive mode. I mean, you are going to have to make sure you're committing resources from your firm. And I know, I mean, you mentioned you were the CFO. Obviously, there's a lot of things you're worried about other than technology, but make sure you are allocating some time for corporate resources to be thinking about these problems, and make sure you have a consulting firm that can really ask you the right questions and proactively go after problems as opposed to you having to tell them exactly what to do. Because I mean, without the resources, you need somebody that can kind of run with these problems. You say, here's a challenge I need to figure out. You go figure out and recommend to me what do I do about it. It's really going to come down to the firms you work with, and potentially an RFP might help with that problem. Does that answer your question, Roy?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Dave.
Did I miss any other questions?
Nope, not on my end.
Okay, so next I'll go into the next topic that was commonly brought up as challenges you all are facing, is working remotely. Uh, I probably don't have to say too much about this. I'm sure after a year of COVID, you all understand these problems very well. But just to point out a few things that may or maybe you weren't thinking about that should be considered. Obviously, if everybody's working at home, or even worse, on public networks at Starbucks or other places, these networks are not very secure. You know, home networks, oftentimes people won't turn security on or even have security available on some of the devices that they have to give home Wi-Fi. This might be something that you actually even include in those short training programs that I talked about. Maybe one of the topics that's a 5-minute topic is how to set up your home network to be a little bit more secure, how to be secure when you're using a public network, such as at a Starbucks or a Dunkin' Donuts or something like that. Those are all topics that could be that are included in those types of programs, and make sure people understand them and how to use them. Um, you know, a big challenge is, I just told you about how make sure you're patching people's computers and servers and software that you're using. But what happens if Windows has new security problems that are being fixed all the time and patches are being released all the time? You can set up programs to make sure that those patches are being installed on work issued computers, but what about personal computers? This is where I'd say, again, maybe you want a policy that, well, if you want a personal computer on our network, you have to allow us control to implement some of these security fixes when they come out, and do it the same as if it was a company issued computer. Again, people may not like that because it's a personal computer. Like, well, you can't start installing things on my computer. But maybe worth considering is setting that as a policy that if you want that personal computer on our networks, this is something you have to do. Also, some things that are common. Obviously, you all know this problem. Just the fact that we're doing this type of session over a Zoom instead of in person in a training room somewhere. I think we've all pretty much gotten used to it. But well, how do you make sure teams are aware of what's going on around them? Like when you sat in an office, you would often hear about things just because you were walking by somebody or were talking to somebody in the elevator, uh, uh, or just saw them in the lunchroom. How do you make sure that those types of interactions still go on? How do you make sure that people work doesn't become siloed, and that people know what's going on and can adapt to it, or even know that, hey, you're working on the same problem I am. Why don't we partner on this and do it together as opposed to doing it independently? Um, Again, I'm sure you're all dealing with these problems of what's going on. So some things to think about is uh, It's my mistake. I think I somehow overwrote the slide that I had for this. Um, but uh, there's a lot of tools out there. Let me actually go skip to the next slide. I actually have an Excel spreadsheet that's embedded in this presentation that will send out after the fact that lists many different types of tools that you might want to consider using. Um, uh, there's things such as collaboration tools for how can you whiteboard, like how can you sketch out solutions to problems while everybody's working remotely? How can you track tasks that people are working on and doing so that everyone can see what people are working on? Having chats. There's a lot of tools that are out there that might be worth considering using. Again, the Excel file that I provided lists a lot of them that are out there. One thing to point out about this Excel file is, so some of these tools I am intimately familiar with and can say that they're secure and viable solutions, but I listed a lot of tools that are out there on the market. I may not necessarily have experience with all these or have done due diligence on, are these tools reputable from a security standpoint? So in some cases, I'm just kind of listing them as, here are some options to consider, but you may still need to do some due diligence on some of these tools to be sure that they are secure or meet the needs that you have. Microsoft Teams is a particular tool that I like a lot. I think it's very good at helping with collaborations. Obviously, we're using Zoom right now, so it's good. But just the ability to kind of walk through problems on a whiteboard and do that in a group setting and kind of brainstorm together on how to solve problems. These are the sort of things that were always reserved for in-person meetings. There are tools out there that help with this problem, and especially with COVID, more and more companies are trying to address this problem. So I would just suggest, kind of look for these tools, try some things. And again, this trend is not going to go away with COVID ending. This trend will continue. So spending time and figuring out tools you can use is not going to, be wasted effort because it'll stop after COVID's over. It will continue. So any questions about working remotely or things to consider there? I see somebody's mentioning about a hack that occurred that exposed donation records, and the museum spent weeks recovering data. Yeah, these things get very challenging. I've heard about one issue where somebody's email account was breached, and the trouble is, this particular person was sending a lot of sensitive data in emails. So their email account had all these Excel files embedded in embedded in different emails in their sent box. And of course, if the email account is breached, that means all information that is anywhere in that email account, such as Excel files that were attachments on emails, would be considered at risk. So from California law, let's say an Excel spreadsheet was found in one of those emails that had 1,000 people with their personal information. You now are obligated to notify them that their information was breached. You may even also have to pay for services such as a credit monitoring for them. These are all things that might have to happen. And another reason why you shouldn't use email, because even taking the time to figure out what information may have been in a breached email account would take a lot of time. It's not a system that's well documented as to what's in it. It could be anything and everything that's in that email account.
Dave?
Yes.
This is Janet from SCID PDA. Would that also include embedded links as well to networks? For example, if we use email to share information that has an embedded link,
Yep. Well,
okay.
so I guess I should point out that I'm not a lawyer. I could give you my perspective from a technology standpoint, but I guess what would be a legal problem, I guess I can't necessarily speak to. But I think links are preferred as long as going to that link is password protected and, as I was saying before, two-factor authentication protected. As long as you can only get to that link if you're authorized to do it, then that's preferred. So put links in emails. Like for example, if you store a file on Microsoft Teams and then send an email saying, hey, you can access this information by going to this link on Microsoft Teams, that's perfectly fine. In fact, it's preferred because then you can still notify people through the email, but you're not putting that sensitive information in the email.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I would just know when sort of trying to, as we're going to share the list of the different remote working tools that your organization can choose to implement, try to also think about the media richness. So which technology is able like to carry the nonverbal cues, provide rapid feedback, convey personality traits. Like these are important to take into account because it also depends on the type of information it is that you want to receive. So depending on that, you'll pick your media tool or communication tool.
Right. And I would also ask you, feel free after you see this list, if you try a tool and either really like it or dislike it, let us know. I mean, I would love to, I want to make sure we do these types of sessions with a lot of people in the future, and input from what is working and what is not working at different places will really help to be sure that we're providing good information out to people. So feel free to share your experiences after you start using these tools. Any other questions? I know somebody out there has something, so go ahead and jump in. You're just thinking about how to best word the question. All right, so just to end, I mean, this is more of just a kind of recap of some of the main points I made. I've already kind of gone through the main action items, but just again to recap, get that governing body in place, figure out who can make decisions on what are your priorities and what do you work on. Set short-term goals from that body. Find the right consultants who can kind of take it and run with it, that don't need as much direction from you to run with these problems. Obviously, you want them constantly getting your feedback as they're implementing it, and that you're giving them information on what risks they must mitigate. But find the right consulting firm that can really take these ideas and run with them once you set priorities based on this committee. Don't be stuck in analysis paralysis. That's the old world of IT. Spending months and years evaluating what might happen. By the time you make a decision, it's possible the technology you decided on is obsolete or doesn't even work anymore, or something else is much better out there now. So begin to make changes, get them out there, learn based on what's going on, and make changes. Communicate about the importance of cybersecurity to everyone. It is everybody's responsibility for cybersecurity. I often hear about like, well, we have a chief of information security officer. They're responsible for keeping things safe. It's like, well, they do a lot and they can do a lot, but they can't solve the problem. It really is everybody's responsibility. And make sure that your employees understand that. Use the training I was talking about. Do these short sessions, and have programs or policies in place that say, okay, you have to take maybe 3 of those 5-minute training sessions every quarter or every half year, or whatever you want to set. It's really up to you. But those types of things really do help. I didn't necessarily make this point before, but it kind of implied it, is cybersecurity and data privacy are going to be critical to your IT infrastructure. Have that expertise. If you're using consultants, make sure that those consultants have that expertise. Ask them questions about how important cybersecurity seems to them. Of course, everybody's going to say that they take cybersecurity very, keep it very important. They're all going to talk about having SOC 2 certifications, but just asking them some questions, you can get an idea of, do they really consider this important? Some red flags to look for, like for example, if they were to send you an email with a Excel file that has 1,000 people with their personal information, that might be a red flag. Okay, do these guys really take security seriously? Make sure your vendors have that in their toolbox and are thinking about it, and be sure to hold them accountable to it. Standardize on those platforms. Don't think about which platforms you should use after the fact. Make sure that's part of the conversation as you're implementing technology. Don't have, a way of doing integrations where you do 6 different technologies to do the same thing. That will be very expensive to maintain over time. Implement VPN tools. So I talked about, a bad thing to do is to do work from a public network, because when you're sitting on a public network, it's very easy for people to get onto your computer and access information or see information that you're sending out. A good thing a VPN does is it ensures all traffic that's being sent either from your computer or to your computer is encrypted. So that's a good tool to look for. And in that Excel file, I actually list some VPN tools that are out there to consider, but there are many of them on the market. So definitely look for one that works best for you. And continue to work on enabling remote collaboration. This will be a trend that will continue for the foreseeable future. It will not slow down. So that's all the topics I had. So any other questions or comments or things you just want to talk about? By the way, I noticed one of you mentioned, I don't remember who it was, but one of you mentioned in the sign up for this session about how you're having challenges doing data conversions with the CRM implementation. I'd be more than happy to join you offline. Actually, I have a lot of experience with CRM. I used to work with Salesforce, and before that, Siebel, if you're familiar with what that is. And I've done a lot of data conversions in CRM, so I'd be more than happy to talk to you after, or even now if you think it might be useful to the group. Anything out there? I know I didn't explain things that well. There's got to be some questions.
Are there things that, as folks sign up for the session, you list your challenges? Was there anything that you had mentioned in your response that we might not have covered?
I think I got after the main points of what were there. But yeah, definitely. If anybody has a topic that I didn't talk about, feel free to bring it up.
Or of all the things that Dave mentioned in terms of tools to look into, were there anything that jumped up at your organization that you might want to look deeper into?
And I would be more than happy, if any of you want to touch base with me. I think you all have my email address now, so I'd be more than happy to talk to you about some things. From my perspective, it'll help me because it'll help me better understand challenges that you all are facing, and can be sure I can kind of think about those problems and get better answers out to people. And plus, also hopefully, I can help you on solving some of these problems. So it doesn't sound like there's any questions. So Camilla, we might be able to end early. What else did you have on the agenda?
Yeah, nothing. If there are no more questions, I think we can go ahead and end early. Like I mentioned, we'll be sharing the presentation, the Excel file that was mentioned in Dave's slides. And yeah, and of course, if in the follow-up email, if you have any additional questions, we're obviously welcome to answer them then.
Yep, and feel free to reach out to me directly if you have anything you wanted to talk about. I'd be more than happy to help out.
Great.
Well,
Thank you
thank
so
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.